Hello and good morning, everybody. Welcome once again to the 2022 CCOVI lecture series. My name is Dan Dakin and I'll be your moderator and host again today. Our lecture today will run for about 45 minutes and then we'll have a question and answer period at the end. So please feel free to use the chat box at the side of your window, ask any questions that you'd like, and I will read those out at the end. So I'm very excited today to welcome Professor Liette Vasseur as our speaker. Liette Vasseur is a full professor in the Department of Biological Sciences here at Brock University. She's a member of the Environmental Sustainability Research Center and a CCOVI Fellow. Since 2014, she has held the UNESCO Chair on Community Sustainability from Local to Global at Brock. Her research program is interdisciplinary and links issues such as sustainable agriculture, climate change adaptation and resilience, community-based ecosystem management, and ecosystem governance. Her research is in Canada, China, Ecuador, Burkina Faso, and Senegal. In Canada, 3 major projects focus on organic and sustainable vineyards in the Niagara region, where she studies responses of the ecosystem to alternative techniques and climate change adaptation in rural and coastal communities. She is president of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, the deputy chair of the Commission for Ecosystem Management at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and co-editor-in-chief of the journal Botany at the Canadian Science Publishing. So today, Professor Vasseur is going to share a lecture titled Exploring Different Cover Crops to Adapt to Climate Changes. And with that, Professor Vasseur, I will turn it over to you. I'll say thank you very much for joining us. Please share your screen and go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to present today. So I'll just share my screen. And hopefully everything is okay. So so today I wanted to present a part of some of the research that we're doing, which is exploring different cover crops to adapt to climate change, because this is sometimes quite a challenge for most grape growers. So just to recap, first of all, and I will be talking mostly for the Niagara region. When we look at climate change, we're already starting to feel the effect of it. In terms of temperature, for example, we have increased by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius between 1901 and 2016. I should say the warmest years on record were the 19 since 2000, and 2020 was in fact 1.02 Celsius warmer than average. What we know also is that the Great Lakes in general are warming up. And for example, if we look at Lake Superior, which is a very large lake, so think about how it works for Lake Erie or Lake Ontario at that point, but we're talking about 2.5 degrees Celsius higher between 1979 and 2006. Since 1951, the total annual precipitation has also increased by 13.6%, and the frost-free season has increased by 16 days since 1951. So all these are going to change the way that we do agriculture. And when we look at the prediction for this region, we can see that it's quite high in terms of possibilities of change again. If we look at air temperature, we're talking about 1 to 7 degrees Celsius increase by 2080. Greater increases, especially in the winter. So that means that also we'll have also a frost-free period and growing season increasing. We know in terms of precipitation, we're talking about 20% increases in annual precipitation by 2080. And the increase is mostly in rainfall. It will be a decrease in snowfall. And we expect that spring precipitation will increase and a decrease in summer precipitation. So that means that we may have more frequent extreme rain effect or events, and an increase also in frequency and extent of droughts. as well. And although it's less sure, but I would say except this year, we certainly will have wind gust events that are going to increase, as well as freezing rain events, especially if we don't get snow in the winter and we are at a low temperature. Freezing rain may become more frequent. So the objective of this project, and I should say it's almost projects now, is really to understand a lot more how we can use the cover crop especially, and I will focus really on cover crop today, to better protect, if you want, the soil, and this way the grapes for in relation to changes in temperature and precipitation. So we have through the Ontario, Organic Science Cluster, we have also other objectives, especially in terms of rootstocks and irrigation strategies. And I will talk a little bit about the irrigation strategies in some way with that. And the idea behind that, as you can imagine, is really protecting the ecosystem in a way that it can improve grape production quality, as well as increase sustainability in the long term. So the components that we are considering in terms of research here, we have greenhouse and field experiments. We have looked at the selection of cover crop species, and this will be between row and below vines. And we are doing the monitoring of different rootstock. However, I will not be talking about that today, as well as the monitoring of the ecosystem in terms of soil and vertebrate community, vegetation community, and vineyard performance. Unfortunately, I will not be able to talk about everything. Already just the cover crop, it's quite complex by itself, and we'll be focusing on that today. So the first step was really the screening of the cover crop. I should say that this experiment or this project is conducted here in the Niagara region, as well as in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, with my colleague, collaborator, Mehdi Sharafi. And so in our region here, we have 2 vineyards. They are both organic. But we have to remember we have what we call the cool climate with variable winters, while in the Okanagan Valley, there are 3 vineyards and they are dry climate with mild winters. So what we wanted to know is, do we have the same type of selection? Which species will be better in which type of environment? What we have here in Niagara is we have 1 vineyard that is irrigated and 1 that is not irrigated. And as I mentioned, we did in row and between row cover crop establishment. When I look at cover crop, I look mostly at what we call nature-based solution. So nature-based solution is a way to try to enhance and prevent, for example, especially damage, if you want, on the production. So it really relates to sustainable agriculture. And we talk about here at that point the prevention, for example, of leaching and volatilization of nutrient, radiation protection, maintain soil moisture, carbon sequestration, biological control agents, increase microbial activities and diversities in the soil, as well as at the end, although it's a perennial plant, so we know that the effects will not happen within only a couple of years, enhance grape yield and quality. And you can see here the type of the importance of, especially for the soil, to better protect against also erosion and possibility of weed control. We'll see that later. So in terms of the process for the species screening that we are using, and this is, I have to give the credit to Mehdi that was better at doing that than me, is we start first by selecting the seeds or the species we wanted to look at. And this was done through a literature research, which indicated the species that were the most tolerant or could be the most tolerant to drought and saturated soil conditions. So saturated soil condition, especially when you have a flood after heavy rain effect. So what you have here is the seed selection. Once we have the species, potential species, we are looking at seed price, seed availability, and the cost of establishment and maintenance. So these are the first three components that we looked at. And I should say that some of the species will gradually be, in fact, they are already in some cases eliminated because either they were not available or the price was quite high. We also have the physical or physiological and related criteria. So we wanted to make sure that we have annuals and perennials. We wanted to look at if it's possible for self-seeding. We're looking at their biomass, so how much biomass is going to be produced, the coverage, so how much of the surface they are going to cover in the vineyards, the flowering date, and that is very important, especially if we're looking, for example, at promoting parasitoids against leafhopper, for example. And finally, the interference with the fruiting zone, especially for below the vine. We needed to make sure that the plants are not too high so that they can affect the wind flow and affect then the berries. And finally, the level 3 is related to biotic and abiotic stress related criteria. So we have to be careful that we don't introduce more invasive species. So we have to be careful of the type, especially if they are exotic, we have to be careful. We're looking also at weed biomass and weed coverage to see what is the level of competition that we have between the cover crops and the weeds. We look at pest hosts because these cover crops may be beneficial in some cases to attract pest enemies, but they may also bring other pests. We have to be careful about that. We have to look at their level of drought resistance, regrowth, especially when we have the mowing during the season, and also with winter hardiness. Now, in our case, what we have started is with greenhouse experiments. So in our case, we had 6 legumes and 3 grasses that we decided that were selected from the literature review and that we wanted to test in terms of how they would be responding to drought and saturated soil moisture. So we have crimson clover, berry clover, yellow sweet clover, pearl millet, pubescent wheatgrass, red clover, alfalfa, hairy vetch, and red fescue. So this was initially what we had to test what can work or not work in our conditions. So the experiment was carried out at the Cairns greenhouse at Brock University. And first of all, the field capacity had to be determined to know how much moisture we had or water we needed to add in during the experiment under control condition as well as drought and flooding conditions. So that was done initially to make sure that everything was fine. Then the soil was also clean, sterilized. The pots were also sterilized with Vicron to make sure we don't have any other effect from the environment. And the 3 conditions that we had was, as I said, saturated soil or flooding. And at that point, it was 100% of field capacity daily. Control was at 60% field capacity every 2 days. So giving a bit some time for some drying of the soil. And finally, the drought. And the drought was at 20% of field capacity once weekly. So that means they were watered only once a week. We had 9 replicates per treatment, per species, and they were grown for 53 days. Now, just to give a little bit some information, and I'll show only a few of the graph because we have a lot of different graphs. I should say that at the end of the experiment, at day 53, first of all, the plants were harvested, and the shoots versus the roots were separated, and the fresh weight was measured. Then it was put in the dryer to have dry material, and the dry weight was measured at the end. So we were able to, this way, measure, for example, the live fine fluid moisture per species, and this is what you have here. So on the y-axis, what you have is the live fine fluid moisture, and on the x-axis is the different species that were tested. As you can see, some species didn't vary too much between the different conditions. So if you look at wheatgrass, for example, or yellow clover, pretty much the same. There's no significant variation between among the three treatments. However, when we get to Bernstein clover, for example, or alfalfa, there's quite a lot of difference with the dry condition changing quite rapidly the issue of moisture. And that's something that we had to keep in mind. Now, in terms of the different variable, because we measure the mean individual, so per plant. So we always went for per plant, total dry weight, root and shoot dry weight. We look also at root and shoot ratio, and as I said before, moisture level. So in this case here, this is a graph where on the y-axis you have the mean relative variation. So that means the difference between, for example, the total dry weight coming from the drought conditions versus the control. So the difference, relative difference, this is what you have here, and the same for the saturation. So what we wanted to look at is how much the plants compared to the control is reacting in the drought versus the saturated soil. So what you have here is, first of all, that under saturated conditions, so this is the gray bars, Bernstein clover followed by hairy vetch are doing quite well. As you can see here, BC is for Bernstein clover, and HV is for hairy vetch, and you can see that their relative change compared to the control was higher. In terms of drought, pearl millet followed by yellow clover were the most interesting in terms of not having, if you want, resisting to the decrease in growth. So the zero bar being that they are exactly the same than the control. Below means that they are lower weight compared to the control, and higher means higher weight than the control. And we can see here that in the case of pearl millet and yellow clover, they were not as down as the others. And that was significant in terms of statistical analysis. The least variation, if we look at the variation from the control in terms of drought and saturation, we can see that pearl millet and yellow clover are the ones that resist the most, so that they are the most capable of withstanding variation in one way or another from the control. The worst plants, especially in this case, was alfalfa and red fescue. So we already kind of knew that these species may not be doing well even in the field. So the take-home message from the greenhouse experiment was that we had potential plants that we wanted to test most likely, including Bernstein clover, hairy vetch, wheatgrass, pearl millet, and crimson clover. And in terms of potential drought plants, pearl millet and yellow clover were suddenly the one that were more interesting for us. So this was the basis to decide on how we would be doing field testing. So the field testing started in 2019 with what we call species screening. So as you can see, the list here is quite still very long. We added, for example, buckwheat and green lentils because discussion with Mehdi was that these will probably be very good, as well as white clover. And we had also the ryegrass because this is a standard species that most vineyards are using. And I should say that, interestingly enough, wheatgrass and red fescue in 2019 were unavailable for our seed producers. So that was also quite interesting. So in this case, we had panels. We had at least 5 replicates plots for each of these different cover crop and be able to see how it works. In this case, they were only between rows. And this is what we have in what we call the Vineyard 1, which is irrigated, and how the species fared in terms of biomass. On the y-axis, you have their biomass and the treatments over time. So that means from 0 when we seeded them until day 74, which was at that point in October. And as you can see here, crimson clover was the one that did the most and accumulated quite a lot of biomass over the season. The second and third species, which had pretty much the same biomass by the end of the season, was pearl millet and clover, red clover. So these are the one that gave us a bit some idea of what's happening. Just to remember that 2019 was a year of screening. It was also a year of screening for the same different cover crops in some cases in British Columbia. So in this case, he had several more because he had three vineyards. And here what you have is intergrow and in-row species that he has been able to look at. We know that some of them were probably not going to work here, so we didn't necessarily use them here. Just to give you some of the photos from the vineyards in British Columbia. So these are in the alleyway, and the first one is on, well, they're all taken in July. And the first one was tillage radish with perennial ryegrass. And you can see here also ryegrass with buckwheat, and how buckwheat can get pretty high. The issue that we discussed very quickly is as soon as buckwheat is being mowed, it disappeared. So that's something that has to be considered in terms of it reduces a lot of the coverage of plants on the ground. It is important also to note that the operation of the vineyards, because we're on operating vineyards, are different between British Columbia and Niagara, where contrary to Ontario, the soils were tilled in this case, and plants were watered for establishment. So that was a little bit different than what we had here in Ontario, where we have no tillage, and we didn't water, especially in the non-irrigated vineyard, we didn't water the plants. So the establishment in our case was natural. This is one thing also that, unfortunately, because of the drought in British Columbia, as you know, buckwheat, we discovered very quickly that is very sensitive to drought and will not survive very well. This species screening continued in 2020 with some challenges. It was delayed because of the COVID pandemic and the capacity to go in the field. And in this case, we had eliminated several of the species like buckwheat, from the list. We have added, however, because this time we were able to get the wheatgrass seeds, we added that one. And what you have here is either that we had pearl millet, wheatgrass, hairy vetch, crimson clover, or a mix of these different species. And in this case, we had 3 replicates in it because they were larger. We had 2 panels instead of 1. We also added what we call another type of control, which is resident vegetation. So resident vegetation means that there was no other species added than the weeds and what is there already. In this case, in terms of biomass, again on the y-axis and the over time, as I said, because of the delay to start the experiment, in this case, we were only at 53 days of growth, starting more in June instead of early May, in fact, April almost. So in this case here, what we can see is that pearl millet did very, very well, followed by the mixture of wheat and pearl millet and the mixture of pearl millet and hairy vetch. One thing to underline is that 2019 was a cool and wet year, and 2020 was a quite dry year. And in fact, the plants had to establish at the time that we started having very warm temperature. And this is, by the way, from the vineyard number 2, which is a non-irrigated vineyard. So we can see that pearl millet was very good at dry condition to survive. Again, continuing with the species screening in 2020 in the irrigated field. In this case, you can see that not all the time they did very well, but pearl millet again did quite well, followed by hairy vetch and crimson clover. One thing that we have here is the biomass in terms of dry weight. And this is for, in blue, the cover crop, and in green, the others. So for those who may be blind, colorblind, on the left is your cover crop. On the right bar is the other species. The other species being mostly weed, but they could have been other species that were there before, like ryegrass. And you can see that in general, except for the pearl millet, usually the others, so the weeds, were more predominant. It is important to underline that in 2020, the weeds were there a lot longer before we were able to overseed, because they were overseeded, the different cover crops. The final decision for selection for a multi-year field study started in 2021. And in this case, now we have 3 panels instead of only 3 rows, I should say, 2 panels. And in this case, we had pearl millet, crimson clover, and hairy vetch separately, so in monoculture, as well as a mixture of the 3 together. And this time we have 2 controls, the ryegrass, as well as the spontaneous control. And these are the preliminary results from the non-irrigated field. As you can see, you have again on the y-axis the mean dry weight. These are, by the way, 25 by 25 centimeter quadrat. Because we're repeating during the season, we don't want to be at exactly the same place at the time, and that means that we cut the plants at only around 1 centimeters everywhere in the quadrat. And again, you have the cover crop versus the weed, and unfortunately the cover crop didn't establish very well. The reason is that in 2021, we thought we were doing wonderfully well. And since the spring started early, we seeded in early April. And fortunately, as you know very well, the 3rd week of April, we had the snowstorm. So many of the young seedlings of the cover crop, unfortunately, died. And because of well, lack of seeds and all that, we were unable to reseed. Now, we wanted also to look at below vine row, and for many reasons. This is something that is done quite a lot, especially in New Zealand and some other places. But we wanted to see how it can help in terms of erosion control, temperature control, as well as attraction of parasitoids and other beneficial invertebrates. So we wanted to look at other type of species that may be good at this level. So we started in this case in 2021, and this is the layout. In 2020 was the year of screening a bit, and 2021 was the one that we wanted to do more control experiment, in which we have 3 rows in which we had Allison, 3 rows with control. So that means that what the vineyard is doing is what is there. And finally, 3 rows with crimson clover. So each row is around 69 meters. So we looked at what's happening in terms of growth of the cover crop, but as well as the weed and the parasitoids and other like leafhopper and other type of invertebrate that we can find in this case there. So just to show the parasitoids results, which is giving us a little bit for now, but these are just preliminary results. And this is from the 2020 screening, in which we had the alyssum, the crimson clover, but also the purple top turnip. We removed in 2021 the purple top turnip because it went too tall and was a big problem. But we felt that the alyssum and crimson clover were quite could have a good potential. As you can see, other species than parasitoids we have, and this is what we have to expect. But now it's to look at more precisely. We're still identifying, I should say, several of the species. So we're looking at what will happen in terms of the differences there. Now, the other question that is coming up is it possible that crimson clover can reestablish, especially last summer, this is a photo from last summer, is that the seed, it produced a lot of seed. Most of the seeds were dropping on the ground. So we are hoping that crimson clover can reseed itself. Alyssum, I know in my place, reseeds itself all the time, and it's a few years now I don't have to plant it, but we don't know with the mounting and all that under the vine if that may probably slow down the possibility of growing. Now, again, you have the mean dry weight of the species. So alyssum, crimson clover, and spontaneous not having any cover crop. And one thing that is interesting is we can see a decrease in terms of weed, especially with alyssum. However, alyssum is a small plant, so we have to expect that its weight will be less. And we still have a lot of data that have not been analyzed yet from 2021, including the parasitoids, the percentage cover, etc. We're still working on the data analysis right now. In British Columbia, for under vine, what was found is that the crescendo and ladino white clover was the most interesting, the most promising in their case, and covered quite well. Now, you have to remember the soil is tilled and the plants are watered, but this is a 2-3 year perennial. It's unfortunately slow to establish, and unfortunately it's not drought tolerant. So this is something that needs to be looked at. This means that there wouldn't be a need for irrigation in this case. So as you can see, species selection is not that easy. There are many conditions, many challenges to deal and to look at. Including the climate, because our 3 years for now have been completely different from one to the other. The seed availability, especially for organic vineyards, is something that is to consider. As I said, wheatgrass, most of the time it is, but not all the time available. The seed prices is a question, especially for Allison, for example, which is a little bit more expensive than I would say many of the other species that we have been using. Species establishment, especially for vineyards with no-till, this is always a big issue because there's high competition with the weeds, and at the same time, the soil may not be all the time propitious for the establishment and the germination of the seeds. The growth and competition against the weed is something to be careful, and it seems until now anyway that our mixtures usually are doing better than monoculture in terms of cover crop. We have to ensure also tolerance to droughts and flooding. As we said, buckwheat, for example, is not very good against drought, so it's not a species that has a high potential. There's potential to probably host disease and pests, and this is something that we want to look further, that needs to be worked on, as well as beneficial for parasitoids or other type of pest enemies, like, for example, spiders. We know that complexity of, and so that means increased biodiversity through a mixture of seeds, can help enhance and promote spiders, for example, habitat. So current results, we're still confirming some species in British Columbia that are not always the best also for the climate and soil and the management practices here in Ontario. So it's really region dependent, and probably even the way that we discuss is management dependent, as well as soil dependent, etc. Just a little note that I like to always put when I talk about climate change, because I've been working on it for a long time, and especially working in communities, it's often the question of people not understanding the difference between weather, which is the short-term state of the atmosphere, versus the climate, which is a long-term pattern of weather. And usually this is measured through the accumulation of at least 30 years of data. So what we see in 1 year can vary a lot from another year, and this is related to weather. But it is very important to look at it because, as you can see from the data right now, we have a big difference between years. And this is amplifying with climate change. So what was probably highly predictable before is less and less predictable. And this is what makes this kind of work quite challenging. And this is why we need to have more than just a couple of years of data, because we can see how it can change over time. The expected outcomes of cover crop use, as we said, it's especially related to agroecosystem resilience to climate change, with enhancing ecosystem services in the vineyards. And this is being shown not only here, but in other regions, especially New Zealand has been more active, as well as some parts of the US on that, and provide guidelines for combined adaptive strategies that can aim at organic wine production. But I should say many parts of this research is also highly applicable in conventional vineyards. One thing that became very important over this project, and this is something that I want to expand on, is the importance of the landscape, because we know that, well, a vineyard is not a bubble by itself. There's a lot of interaction with the natural environment that is around, and this is where a lot of either seeds, so that means also weeds, but also pests and pest enemies can be coming from. So a better understanding that can help a lot in figuring out what are the challenges, what are the influence of these environment on what's happening in the vineyard. So I would like to acknowledge a lot of people that have been part of this team, either here in Ontario or in British Columbia. And you can see the list, and I think we even miss a few. So I would like to also acknowledge the funding from the Organic Science Cluster, as well as different other organizations like the British Columbia Wine Grape Council, the Canadian Grape Certification Network, as well as all the 5 vineyards that have been put a part of this project. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Vasseur. It's always, yeah, your work is always interesting and always so important, of course, to the industry and trying to deal with such an important issue that everybody is dealing with. A couple of questions here. The first is cover crops may also have a potential economic value as fodder crops. For example, would it defeat their role in erosion control or soil health more generally if they were harvested at some point in the growing season?
That's a very good question. Yes, in fact, there are some cover crops that have been used in the past as economic values. And you can think about turnips, for example. I should say in British Columbia, I have photos that have very good turnip, and supposedly the students were able to bring them home after. So there are some of them that can be quite useful. Pearl millet, green lentils, for example, in British Columbia has more potential. Unfortunately, we were unable to get good seeds here. So this is why we have not tried it. But yeah, and in some cases, it can be, if you want an alternative income for these vineyards, yes.
And would harvesting that that product then, do you think that would impact anything, or it sounds like those two things could sort of happen,
it's all
collaborative?
Yeah, it all depends on the size. The turnip, it's okay if it's in the alleyway and it remains low because you don't want to change the wind flow. So that's one thing to be careful. It's a question when these things can be harvested. It's the same for pearl millet or with green lentil or anything like that. It's a question of how much can be harvested. If you need to mow, you may not get to the seeds, and at that point, for sure, you'll never get any crop. But that's something that has to be better examined in the long term.
So where do things go from here? What's on your priority list, and what do you see as being sort of the next stage of this research, and even as you look maybe a little further down the road?
Well, first of all, we still have one more year of field work to do, so we're getting ready for the next season, which we don't know right now what to expect. That's always a big challenge. And we still have a lot of analysis. I should say the COVID pandemic has slowed down a lot of the work in the lab. So a lot of especially the invertebrates have not been identified yet because of that. That has slowed down quite significantly. So we still have a lot of that to do. This summer also, we are in our irrigated vineyard. We are going to introduce also in experimental plots some native species. So what we wanted to look at is, instead of having commercial species that are, sometimes a little bit invasive or exotic, if we could use species that are native from this region that can be used and hopefully can, reseed themselves, so that this way it becomes less of an issue of management and cost for the grape grower. That's one thing. The next step also in the longer is, as I mentioned a bit during the talk, is the importance of the landscape. Trying to better understand the landscape, what's happening what are the interaction between these different components. In Europe, there have been some studies demonstrating how the perimeter, for example, edges can have an impact on what's happening within the vineyards. So, and in some cases, it's highly beneficial. In other cases, it may be not beneficial. We need to better understand the interaction at the landscape level. So this is something that is important. And talking to some of my colleagues, it's also questioned how some of these species may be carrying viruses, for example, and impact a lot more the grapes and the vineyards and the vines and all that. So these are the type of things that we really need to better understand. It's all these interactions. It's complex. There's no one answer, but you know, we have to start better understanding all these interaction and complexity that we have, so that we are better prepared to understand how they will change also over time.
Right. I see. That cause and effect, I suppose, is so important, right? That you're not creating a new problem in trying to fix the existing problem. Mm-hmm. Another question here for you. Was there any thought into what cover crops reduce mildews, or the opposite, are hosts for mildews and should be avoided? I see a few weed species in the vineyard that seem to host powdery mildew, for example.
Yeah, this is the thing is, yeah, some of the weeds are bad for mildew, that's for sure. And some of the grass as well. We have to always be careful about that. So this is something for now, interestingly enough, the cover crop that we have used have not carried mildew with them. We didn't find any detection of mildew, which I'm a little bit surprised in some way, because in 2019, I thought we would probably be stuck with it because it was quite wet. But for now, we have not, that has not been a big issue for us. It's more, some cases, it's more the question also of competition with the weeds that have been probably more the challenge.
An ongoing challenge, I think, for everybody is that the weed control issue. Another question for you here. Given the climate might be 7 degrees warmer in Ontario in the coming decades, are there any cover crop species that perform poorly now but might be better suited to what conditions will be, in the near future?
But this is why we are looking, especially now more and more, as like pearl millet, crimson clover. They seem to be doing good, and we know that they seem to be doing even better. Pearl millet, for example, is used in Israel and in different places. So we know that these species can withstand warmer temperature, and that I think is very important. We really have to start rethinking about some of our plants that, like we know, for example, turnip and radishes, cruciferous species in general are not very tolerant to very high temperature. So they may not be the most suitable. I know that oilseed radish is being used quite a lot now, but this is one species that may not withstand very well, especially with drought conditions.
I guess it really is forcing you to go back and rethink things, right? As you look to the future, and what has worked may not, and what has not worked suddenly becomes a possibility, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think those are all the questions that we have. So once again, I want to say thank you, Professor Vasseur, for joining us today, and everybody who joined us virtually. We will be posting today's lecture online to the COVI website at brocu.ca/COVI. That should be up there in the next day or two. Coming up in the 2022 COVI lecture series, we have an exciting guest as well next week. On Monday, March 21st, we have Vonda Pravado, Chief Marketing and Digital Officer for the LCBO, along with Abe Garge, Vice President of Merchandising for the LCBO. So that will be next Monday, March 21st. The week after that, Monday, March 28th, we have Belinda Kemp, COVI Senior Enologist at Brock University, whose presentation will be Magic of Mushrooms, the potential use of mushroom-derived materials in the winery. And then on April 4th, we have wine writer and author Ronald Jackson on wine and food. perfect marriage or myth. So 3 more interesting lectures to round out the lecture series for this year. So thank you very much, Professor Vasseur. Thank you everybody who tuned in, and we look forward to speaking with you again in another week. Have a great day.